around 1900 BCE, the Harappans moved. They moved from the northwestern India to the east, which is North India, and to the south, to South India. In essence, the Harappans became the ancestors of both North Indians and South Indians. So this is also new understanding. Their language might have shifted to Indo-European in the North India, but the culture and the practices that were perfected in the crucible of the Harappan civilization was carried over to all parts of the country by the Harappans. They are the glue that holds the Indian culture together in many ways, which we have not yet realized. If houses in India are built around courtyards, that's a practice that started in the Harappan civilization. The peepal tree is sacred. We still consider it sacred. You will find the beginnings of that in the Harappan civilization. The basic cooking pot, the hundi, or the handi, or the many other things, the kullad, many other things, they find their origins in the Harappan civilization. You would find many seals that remind you very strongly of yogic postures. So there are a large number of things. There's a vase from the Harappan civilization in Lothal, which has a picture, which is a drawing of a crow near a pitcher, and with a deer looking back at it, which reminds you strongly of the story of the thirsty crow drinking water from a pitcher by putting stones in it. So if that is the case, some of the stories that we tell our children are stories that the Harappans told their children. So this is the sauce that spread over both North India and South India, and the sauce that spread over the pizza, and the Harappans are the ancestors of both North Indians and South Indians. Then come the cheese and the toppings. It's both the Aryans as well as the Austroasiatics, who they may not be spread all over the country. They might be spread more. The Arya are not spread. They are spread all over the country, but more in some regions than less in other regions. And the same for many of the Austroasiatics also. They are more in some regions, less in some regions. Those are the toppings. And also all the other migrations that happened in historical times or later on. The Huns, the Sakas, the Greeks, the Arabs, the Mughals, there's no end to it. None of them left a big enough impact on Indian demography. Some of them may have caused a major impact on our culture, like the past is very small, but they have had a major impact on our culture. So cultural impact may be high in some cases, but the demographic impact on India of these later, I'm not talking about the four migrations. The four migrations are major ones. Outside of that, the ones in brackets, they have had limited impact on Indian demography. Why is that? Because we are a large population. One thing I forgot to mention is that when around 35,000 years ago, when modern humans were expanding, we now know that by around 20,000 years ago, India was the center of the modern human population. So when anybody says, why is India one of the largest, or soon the largest population, we should say we are merely maintaining our track record. We have been the center of modern human population for about 20,000 years. This place has, and I suspect this would have been true of the archaic humans as well. As I said, the very robust population of them in the country. So this land has been good to Homo species in general for a very long time. It's also brought a culture change, because the Arya brought a newest lifestyle, which is more pastoral, mastery of a horse, metallurgy, newer ways of thinking, and they changed their lifestyle not just in India, but as I said, they went to Europe over more than 1,000 years earlier, and you can see that as they spread, the settlements changing, disappearing, because it's the new lifestyle, it's a new powerful lifestyle of the times. And you can imagine why, because you have the horse, you can herd large cattle, you can move, you are mobile, and it's not surprising that if it is the new modern fast moving lifestyle compared to the settled, sedate life of the farmers. And that's happened both in Europe and in South Asia. Just a list of the later day toppings after the 4 major migrations. The Greeks, the Sakas, the Huns, the Arabs, Mughals, Portuguese, French, Dutch. Small genetic impact, but large, sometimes large cultural impact. But if you were to ask, what is the most tumultuous period in the history of India, there is a straightforward and simple answer. You don't even have to think about it. There is no period in the history of India that is as tumultuous as the period between 4,000 years ago to the beginning of the Common Era. That's between 2000 BCE to around 100 CE. There's nothing that compares. Why is that? Just imagine all that happened. A unique civilization, the largest in the world, most populated civilization in the world, that had survived in its mature form alone for 700 years, fell apart almost fairly quickly, but because of a long drought, and the population spread all over. In search of new life, they have to begin life again in new places, new areas. Around the same time, new migrations come from East Asia, bringing new language, new practices, and we also know that it was very male-dominated, because genetic research has shown that if you look at the Austroasiatic language speakers, if you look at their mitochondrial DNA, that is the DNA that is inherited to the maternal line, they're all first Indian. But if you look at the Y chromosome, or that is inherited through the paternal line, that's a lot of it is East Asian. So you can see that this was a very male-dominated migration, possibly. So there are new migrations happening not just from the east. There's also that is happening from the north, from Central Asia, that is dominant enough to change and cause a language shift in North India. So there is no period that is as tumultuous as these 2,000 years, considering all that happened. And what ties it all together is what genetics tells us, that during those 2,000 years, there was a very great deal of genetic mixing that happened, of the kind that did not happen earlier nor later. So those 2,000 years has formed us as a population in many ways, because until then, remember, by 4,000 years ago, all 4 major components of Indian population are in. The out of Africa migrants are in, West Asians are in, the East Asians are in, the Central Asians are in. And the next 2,000 years, what we see is a mixing of a kind that touches everybody. Nobody is left out. Today, if you look at the most remote tribal group, you will find that's also mixed. So that's the level to which mixing happened during 2,000 years. The only people left out of it were the Andamans, who were the people in Andamans who were cut off from the mainland, and therefore the mixing did not happen to this extent. Of course, it happened later after the British took over the Andamans. That's a different story. But so this is a 2,000-year period of mixing that formed us as we are, and that's what we mean when we say we are a mixture of 4 major components of 4 major streams of migration that formed us as a population. But why we say what happened around 100 CE? That's also what genetics says, that mixing stopped and endogamy took hold. Endogamy is the practice of marrying within one's own community, and it is the distinguishing mark of the caste system. So the genetics says mixing stopped and endogamy begins around 100 CE. So a few things, this changes many assumptions that we had. For example, it was assumed that the caste system may have begun with the arrival of the Aryas. Now we know that's not true, because the Aryas arrived almost 2,000 years earlier. So the caste system did not begin with the arrival of the Aryas. It happened almost 2,000 years later. And by the time the caste system fell in place, mixing had already happened. So that's why Ambedkar is right when he says there's no genetic difference between the Dalits and the others. We're all the same, which is right, because we are a mixed population, like most populations in the world, like all populations in the world. So the way to understand what happened in 100 CE is possibly to look at it as a political development and not as a religious development, though of course with the caveat that it's difficult to separate politics from religion then as it is today. We do not have clear understanding of what exactly happened, how exactly did this begin then, but there are some clues. I think my book gives some clues. We can discuss it later if you want. How many minutes are gone? Okay. So we come to what are the lessons? What are the things that we did talk about things that changed. What are the things that we should take away from what the new findings are? The first one is we are all Indians, we are all migrants, we are all mixed. And that stands true of all parts of the country. And actually we can say it for, when you say it stands true for all parts of South Asia, because India is used in this book not as in the current India, but as India as in the region, as it has always been used historically. So we are all mixed, and this is why someone from outside of the region can look at someone and say, you look like an Indian. Why? Because this is what separates us. This is especially the base of the pizza is unique to us. The rest of it you may find in other parts of the world too, but the base of the pizza is unique to us. Why is that? Because the first Indian ancestry has no close relatives in the world. Why is that? Because the people who came around 65,000 years ago and their descendants who went on to East Asia and other parts of the world, they separated almost 65,000 or 50,000 years ago. So they are no longer close, we can no longer call them close relatives. And outside of South Asia, the first Indian ancestry has no close relatives. So that's what gives us the distinction, the uniqueness. That's what makes someone say, you look like an Indian. Why do you look like an Indian? Because that's the base. This is the formation. Four major prehistoric migrations are our building blocks. Tribals are us. This is again a new understanding. Why? Because we often used to think that tribals somehow are, different from the rest of the population. And it's surprised to find that even Ambedkar, to some extent, seemed to suggest it. But the reality is that it's not true. If the rest of the population shares the maximum with anybody else, and in a genetic sense, it's with the tribals. So the tribals are us, as in quotation marks. They are not different. That's what we share most of our ancestry with. The earliest source of our civilization is the Harappan civilization. To the extent that civilization itself comes from a city, that's the root of civilization. So, and the first city that we have is the cities that we have are in the Harappan civilization. And as we saw, how the practices and beliefs that were made in the crucible of the Harappan civilization were carried across the country. So the earliest source of the Indian civilization is the Harappan civilization. Indian civilization as it is today. The idea of Vedic Sanskrit culture is a very important and significant constituent of Indian civilization as it is today, but it is not the earliest or the only source. And this is what is linked to the sensitivity about the Aryan migration. Because we think it is the idea of Vedic Sanskrit culture is the source of the Indian civilization. That's when you hear that there is Arya migration, then you feel that it's as if the whole of the Indian culture has been imported. But that's not true. What we have created is a mixture of different histories, different migrations that has happened over time. And the second assumption is that if you say there was an Arya migration, then it means that the Vedas, the Sanskrit, all of those were imported in some form and then unpacked and used. That's not true. Sanskrit is a result of the interaction of new migrants with the people who are already existing here. The Vedas were created as a part of the mixing and intermingling between different people who were in India. So Aryan migration doesn't challenge either the uniqueness of the culture that we have created or whatever else that we have created. To give an example, the earliest version of the Sanskrit we know, the Rigvedic Sanskrit, for example, has retroflex consonants like ta, da, na, da. These are words, these are consonants where you have to twirl your tongue and strike your palate. And retroflex consonants are not there in any other Indo-European language, not even in Persian, which is so close, which is like, I mean, you can read Avastha. If you can read Rig Veda, you can read Avastha. That's the kind of closeness that is between Persian, and even Persian doesn't have it. So with maybe some one or two very marginal exceptions, no Indo-European language has retroflex consonants. So how did Sanskrit get it? So because retroflex consonants are a regular feature of pre-Aryan languages already in India, including Dravidian. So it's a clear instance of influence of pre-Aryan languages on Sanskrit in the earliest level of Sanskrit that we know, with the arrival of migrations from Central Asia. So the similar is the case with the scriptures. They all see, for example, the earliest scriptures do not mention yoga, but in later scriptures you can see mention of it. So it's at multiple levels what we see is a mixing of cultures that have come from different parts. So what we have created is a unique civilization, and this is what has happened over this kind of mixing is what has happened in other parts of the world either. This is nothing new. What we know today is that the caste system, we often think it was inevitable. What we now know today is that it was not inevitable. That's not the way that we were going until we came to 100 CE, when we stopped and decided to set the clock back. Because it is counterintuitive, right? It's easy to imagine two groups of people who were not mixing suddenly deciding one day, hey, this makes no sense, let's start mixing. It's much more difficult to imagine two different people who were mixing freely one day waking up and saying, no, we need to put a stop to this. So we need to see that as a political development that happened that set the clock back, and what politics can make, what politics can unmake too. So there's nothing inevitable about it. So these are the broad lessons that one can take, and yeah, so that's where it ends. At a very low productivity level and continue forever, even continuing today. So they all had different rates of success depending on the regions they were in and what possibilities they could find. But modern humans were experimenting with agriculture after the glacial age ended in many parts of the world. In India itself, we know, for example, that in a place called Lahore Deva in Uttar Pradesh, in the Ganga plain, there is evidence of first Indians experimenting with rice harvesting. We do not know whether, if they were harvesting wild rice, that we know, whether that moved into actual cultivation of rice, and then they did it, we do not know. The only thing that we know is that it ultimately did not develop into a rice-based civilization in the Ganga plain, even though we can see them experimenting with harvesting wild rice in Lahore Deva. The earliest place in the subcontinent where you can see actual evidence of agriculture starting and sustaining itself and robustly growing over a long period of time is in a place called Mehergarh in the Balochistan province of today's Pakistan. And in Mehergarh from 7000 BC you can see people, the settlements. You can see that they are beginning to cultivate barley and wheat, not rice. And you can see that some of the burials that they had of the women, they had goats buried along with them around their ankles. So you can see that beginnings of domestication of animals. You can see when you look at their food waste, you can see that in the earlier stages of around 7000 BCE, most of the animals that they eat are hunted, wild animals. But 1,000 years later, you can see most of the animals, more than half of the animals that they eat are domesticated. So this is a place we can see where there is very rapid experiments and additional and happening in terms of both domestication of plants and animals. And genetics is from genetic understanding today, based on ancient DNA, is that there was a migration of people from the Zagros region of Iran into northwestern India around 9,000 years ago or earlier, and that they mixed with the first Asians. It is possible that the first Asians in Mehrgarh were probably already experimenting with agriculture, just as the first Indians in Lahore, and that the arrival of the West Asians might have catalyzed the further development of agriculture. But the point is that agriculture spread across like wildfire across the entire northwestern region, beginning from around 7000 BCE. And that's a mixed population of first Asians, first Indians and West Asians. And it is this agricultural revolution and the productivity that it caused that then leads on to the natural development as the next, the Harappan civilization. Harappan civilization therefore grew out of the agricultural revolution that happened in northwestern India, beginning 7000 BCE. So now we know the answer to one of the questions that we started with: who were the Harappans?